Welcome back to another An Old Man Watches, and today we are going to talk about Chocky, an ITV, so UK television series from 1984. It's a six-part serial. The first of three serials, actually. They made three six-part stories about this, but the first one we're talking about today, which is about what happens after an alien intelligence comes to Earth. The intelligence in question takes the name Chocky, and it's a disembodied energy form, so it has no physical body of its own. And in order to learn about our world, it bonds itself with Matthew Gore, a 12-year-old in the United Kingdom. And it speaks to him in his head and asks him questions. And much of the show is taken up with Matthew's adoptive parents and their concerns about their son's imaginary friend. He's too old for an imaginary friend. Why is he asking all these weird questions? This sort of thing. Because, Chocky's arrival clearly affects Matthew. He starts to ask unusually perceptive questions. He paints strange paintings. He shows evidence of skills that he hasn't shown before in terms of science and mathematics. But none of the changes seem malevolent. And of course, for much of the show, nobody thinks that they're coming from anywhere but Matthew. Of course, eventually, someone is going to suspect the truth, and that's when things might get dangerous. So that is, without too many spoilers, the basic plotline of Chocky. And certainly, as soon as you understand the premise of, kid has an alien in his head, there's a handful of ways this is going to go. So I don't think I've spoiled too much there. But what specifically does Chocky have that I think is worth talking about, or does Chocky feature that I think is worth talking about? Well, as usual, I have three things. So number one, I've called this cultural memory. So for people who grew up in the UK and other Commonwealth countries during the 70s and 80s, as I did, Doctor Who, Blake Seven, The Tomorrow People, these are all shows that are synonymous with our childhood TV memories. All of those shows still have virulent fan bases today. Doctor Who has enjoyed a commercially successful relaunch. The Tomorrow People has had a relaunch, not that long ago, maybe a decade ago, certainly well after 2000. Didn't do so well, but it had one. The only one that hasn't, though people keep wanting one, is Blake Seven, and I would love to see an attempt to do it again. What about Chocky? Well, it did well enough at the time to get two sequels, so people obviously liked it, but it hasn't seemed to remain such a widely remembered, widely loved show. I'm not sure why it didn't strike that same long-term chord with audiences. Maybe it came out a little bit later than the others. Certainly, obviously, Who had been around a lot longer, and both Blake Seven and The Tomorrow People began in the late 70s, so maybe that's it. Generational change, slight shift. Maybe it's that it's not open-ended, and each of, this is over and done within 6 episodes, the follow-up series also are over and done within 6 episodes, so there's not that kind of still... You could tell more stories. Obviously, you could, but maybe it's just not as open-ended a format, and that's why. But yeah, that's just an interesting thought. Second thing, and I called this Time to Talk. I could have called it Trusting the Audience, because the narrative in Chocky takes its time. It lets characters talk to one another about lots of stuff. You got as I said, you've got Matthew's parents discussing what's going on with Matthew. Why does he have an imaginary friend? He's 12 years old. Concerned about his mental well-being. The producers trust the audience to stick along for a quote-unquote slow burn, and I'm putting that in quotes because ultimately this is 6 half-hour episodes of television. It's not that slow. There are movies that are longer than that, they do trust the audience to kind of stick around. I'm not sure that producers of kids TV today do have that trust in their audience. They think things tend to be a lot faster paced. Maybe they're right. Maybe that's a generational change because the pace of information in general and the variety of things available to kids today is so much greater. I mean, when I was growing up in the UK, there were 3 TV channels. We got a 4th around the time that Chocky came out. There wasn't the same scope available. But I think if the show was good enough, kids will stick around for it. I think we tend to underestimate kids and their capabilities in general. And I should also acknowledge, for the sake of transparency, that possibly the slow pace could be a budgetary thing too. Filming a couple of people talking to one another in their living room is cheap compared to doing special effects and action sequences. And even an ITV production, as this was, which means that it was privately funded for profit rather than government funded, as the BBC would be, even ITV productions didn't necessarily have a lot of money in the 80s. And it's kids' TV, which generally didn't tend to get a lot of money in the 80s. So, it could also be that they trusted the audience because they had to basically fit within a pretty restrictive budget. So, finally, we had E.T. in 1982. We had this in 1984, plus sequels in 1985, 1986. And we had Alf in 1986. So we had a run of friendly aliens through the 80s. You have an alien who comes to Earth, intentionally or otherwise, but without any malevolent intention, and then finds itself the target of unfriendly human forces, where we, as the audience, are expected to sympathise and side with the alien and its few, usually young of age friends from Earth. And now I'm not saying that we didn't get evil aliens in the same period. The Thing and Aliens both came out in the Thing in 82, Aliens in 86, same year as E.T. and Alf respectively. But certainly in the family-friendly entertainment sphere, we definitely, in the mid-80s, had this kind of run of sympathetic aliens who may or may not be refugees in some cases, like Alf was a refugee, basically. So run of sympathetic alien refugee, and then suspicion of authorities and their intent and their purpose and their reaction to this benevolent, friendly outsider. It's kind of a shame that this idea of sympathy for those who are different from ourselves doesn't seem to have stayed with us all that well. Definitely there was a something going on in the 80s. It's interesting to see. I mean, obviously this is based on a John Wyndham novel, which was older, and had most of those themes already. But I don't think it's necessarily an accident that it was chosen to be. It was chosen to be adapted to the screen at this time. I think there was definitely something in the water, you might say, at the time that was going on, and we had this little bit of run. It's interesting to look at and say, oh, why did that happen? What was going on? That's Chocky. That's what's interesting about it. I mean, should you watch it? It is quite slow. The effects are very dated. Some of the acting's pretty hammy. But I think like this original six-parter is pretty good. And if you don't mind that it's a bit slower paced, and you don't mind that it's aimed at 10 to 12-year-olds, it's not bad at all. So what are we doing next time? Well, next time we're going to do Creature from the Haunted Sea, a Roger Corman film. Corman is notorious for his cost-cutting make-a-buck ways, and we will talk probably quite extensively about how that shaped this film, because boy did it ever shape this film in a number of interesting ways. So that's next time. In the meantime, thanks for watching this one. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope you'll come back for Creature from the Haunted Sea.